Hello there, my fellow FileMaker learner. This is Matt Petrowski. Let's take a look at what we're going to be talking about today. I am your FileMaker teacher, and today we're taking a look at field naming. So hang in there. We're going to be talking about it right on my desktop in just a few. All right, so what are we learning today? Well, as the title suggested, we're taking a look at field naming. Now, I'd like you to follow along in this video, and hopefully you'd like to follow along. If you're watching this live, it's a little bit hard, but you can always do the replay. If you choose this option right here of Get Started, what's going to come up is a copy of hopefully some type of prompt. If you're using a later version of FileMaker, then it may not look exactly the same, but FileMaker from version to version doesn't change a whole lot. I'm using a copy of FileMaker 16, by the way. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to scroll down, and ultimately, we're trying to get to this part right here where in FileMaker 16, it says See Advanced Solutions, and we'll get this dialog that comes up. Now, what we're most interested in is invoices. It's probably one of the more complex solutions that FileMaker provides, but it is by no means a super complex solution. So when we select that and click Choose, we'll be able to save that to our desktop somewhere. I've already done that, so you can do the same as well, and that gives me a few minutes here while you save your copy, and I'm going to show the copy that I already have open. All right, so what are we learning today? We are learning about field naming, and basically the choices that you make from the outset in terms of when you design your FileMaker database. Now, everything I'm going to show you in this video stems really from my understanding of having worked with FileMaker for well over 2 decades. In fact, as I switch over to Safari here, there is a website that I created back in 2010, I think, and it is FileMakerStandards.org. Now, what I'm going to be showing you is my personal preference of how I like to actually name things within FileMaker. And why is naming things, why does it become so important? Because inevitably your solution grows and grows and grows, and because it grows, it becomes more of a management issue. And that management issue, without strict guidelines that you impose on your own solution, you confuse yourself. Quite honestly, that is what happens to most FileMaker developers if they don't have strong systems. So it doesn't matter whether you follow what I show you exactly here in terms of naming your fields, or whether you come up with some type of variation of this. What's most important is that you actually have a system that you stick to. So we're also going to learn along the way a few things about restructuring this particular database, invoices. I chose it on purpose. So I'm going to open up the define database. Fortunately, we come into the relationship graph right off the bat. And what we're looking at here is FileMaker gives us a limited number of tools in order to make sense of our solution. And we're going to have to make sense of our relationship graph. That is all of our table occurrences. And if you've watched previous videos, these are basically aliases, shortcuts. I think of them as little ghosts. They're basically pointers to our underlying tables, which are these core tables underneath. So first, let's talk about naming the tables themselves. Now, the tables themselves, personally, I am not a fan of using spaces within any of my structure. So I tend to name my tables and my fields without any spaces. It's just something that it's a little bit easier to me, because what happens is in your calculations, this is both in your scripts and your calculated fields, when you start to add a lot of different spaces, it becomes a little bit more difficult to distinguish things. So for example, invoice data for me would actually become invoice data. Now, if invoice data didn't make sense to you, invoice data in this particular case is actually line items, and I would probably go line items as such. Now, the next question that we ask is, do we use plurals or do we use singulars when it comes to naming? I tend to use plurals myself. But when you pick one over the other, try to go with a consistent naming structure. For example, products and customers would become customer and product if you want to go with the singular as opposed to the plural. So if I change this here, customers would just stay customers. Now here, as a FileMaker learner, is a very, very key thing to learn, even though we're talking about naming, and that is the notion of entities. You're going to hear this word entities in all of the rest of database development. It's not specific just to FileMaker, but an entity is a unique object within your database or a unique thing. Now here's the problem that a new FileMaker learner might come across. They distinguish about a unique thing in terms of their categorizations, or how many ways can they be categorized, and they end up making extra tables or extra fields when they're not actually necessary. This is a good point right here, because ultimately what we are dealing with is, are we dealing with, in this invoicing solution, customers? Well, from your perspective, you are dealing with customers, but ultimately they're people. Because what other types of people are we dealing with in an invoicing database? Well, we may be dealing with vendors. So here's the common problem that a new FileMaker user may come across. They think, oh, I need to have a table for customers. Oh, and I also need to have a table for vendors. And then they will go create that. Well, what you've just done in this scenario is you've now created two different tables in order to store the exact same thing: a person. A person is ultimately the entity that you deal with. When you call a vendor, you're dealing with a person. When a customer calls you, you're dealing with a person. And so distinguishing as you're naming and creating your structure in your database really comes down to, what is the truth of the entity that I'm dealing with? Because the distinction between a customer and a vendor is simply just a setting on that particular record. In fact, the same person can be both a vendor to you and a customer as well. They may buy both. So think of that in terms of a radio button, because you would be able to have a person that you would be able to specify as a vendor, also as a customer. It's just a setting. So as I delete this, because we don't want to have that duplicate type of data, oops, I don't want to do this. That's both of them. I just want to delete vendors, the one that I had deleted. I will also remove occurrences because I don't need it on the graph. What I tend to do is I would actually rename this to the ultimate thing that it is. It is people for me, and that is the plural right there. So I'm dealing with people, and those people can be customers and be vendors. And this is where it gets a little bit confusing for some new FileMaker learners, because they would come into a database, and if they saw this database of mine and they said people, well, that's pretty generic. What are people? Where you get to distinguish what those roles are for the people comes into play on the relationship graph. This is where you then get the opportunity to actually name table occurrences according to how they are used. And that's the distinction that I make. So let's go back over there. Let's say products is straightforward. Orders, off the bat, not having designed this database, I don't necessarily know what the distinction is between orders and actual invoices. Maybe in the scenario, orders precedes an invoice before an order becomes an invoice. I don't know because I didn't create this solution. And you always want to take that approach. You want to come back in and reflect on your own conventions that you're using and say, if somebody else came in after me, is the naming that I've chosen to use, is that something that somebody else would be able to understand? Let's say your database becomes a wonderful success and you have to hire somebody else to come in. You're going to be paying them for the learning time that they have to take in order to understand what you've put in terms of the structure. Now, company dashboard, I would probably just go singular. I don't like those spaces, and I would just change it. It always becomes a little bit easier to understand when you go really simple. So we now have dashboard, invoices, line items, people, products, and orders. All pretty straightforward and pretty generic, but still we have the ability to go as flexible as we want. Now let's take a look at fields. So I'm going to switch over to invoices. because it's the one that's got the most fields, and we're going to take a walk through this. Now, when I started to set up the FileMaker standards in terms of my naming, what I started to realize is that there's distinct different uses of fields, of how you use them within your solution. When you're working in FileMaker, there's obviously the data that you're going to store. That's number one. You're going to store some data. But also, FileMaker, I've always thought of it as this big ball of wax, because basically in your structure, you end up adding fields that are used for the purpose of the user interface display. Now, that's not the case in other database systems. When you look at a system that's such as a MySQL or a Microsoft database or an Oracle database, and then you choose some language that's in between, that's PHP or Python or whatever, the database is distinctly separate from how you're going to display some of that data. And the display will come in the form of the language that you choose. Not the case with FileMaker. With FileMaker, you're adding many times fields directly into the structure itself in order to facilitate the interface. So that was always a little bit disconcerting to me in terms of being able to distinguish what is my true data and what is stuff that's being used just for the purpose of, the solution actually running. So I always choose a lowercase structure, and I've sorted this in a certain way on purpose. I've chosen the type right here to actually sort this field on, because it's the easiest way for me to get a clear picture of this database. Because obviously, all of my text fields, those are going to tend to be pure data. Same with number fields, dates, and timestamps. It's when we get down to calculations where I know that a lot of those are used for the purpose of the user interface. And we can see that right off the bat, we have a lot of them that actually happen to be unstored. Now, if you've watched my previous videos, we know that unstored calculations, there's nothing wrong with them in general, but the more that you put on a layout, the slower that FileMaker can become, depending on what those unstored calculations are having to actually calculate. So I personally like to know, whenever I'm adding a field, what is the consequence of that field that I'm adding? So any of these fields that I see right here that are unstored, I have a very explicit way of naming those. We agreed on it at FileMaker Standards. We prefix the field itself with the name unstored. And then it would become something like that, unstored company. There's another benefit that we get from this. If I do a couple of these, let's say let that one, and we'll put unstored here. I won't do all of them, but I'm going to copy this actually. I'll just copy it to the clipboard, take the time, change this one, unstored, invoice, label, plural. I actually use a camel case when I'm naming things, so this would become invoice, label, take out the spaces, plural. So you can see what happens as I'm making these changes right here is the second benefit is that it's grouping things. It's actually grouping them all into one collection of fields. And that's another key tip with regards to naming things. If you do this, especially when it comes to like data, and we can see that if we go over to the customers. In fact, let's do that now. We'll switch over to the people, which I renamed from customers, and we'll take a look at, for example, phone. If I want to see these together, it's a lot easier for me to switch the order and give it the prefix of phone office and phone mobile so that it keeps them together, because ultimately when I'm going to upload this database, meant to just zoom out a little bit there and actually take off phone and put phone at the beginning here and change that and put phone mobile, because ultimately what's going to happen is I am going to be, before I upload this file, as we learned earlier on in the environment aspect of this, before I even upload this file, I am going to be choosing to view this, in my particular case, the way I like to develop, by field name. When I view it by field name, guess what? All of the phones get grouped together and all of the unstored get grouped together. This distinction makes it much easier when you come into your database to see these groups, these logical collections of fields, and it makes it infinitely easier, at least in my opinion, to pick from these things. So first is not just first, it becomes name first, a little bit more clear, and then we have name last, and it groups these things together. So again, all a matter of preference, but these are all things that really make a bigger impact as your solution gets much larger and larger. Calculation indexed. So a calculation that's indexed. In this particular case, I have to ask myself at this stage, with regards to naming this, because what I like to see is I know when I'm going to do an import or export. We need to switch back over to invoices. When I'm going to do any type of import or export, in most all cases, anything that's prefixed with unstored, I don't even need to bother it. I can just dismiss it out of my mind because I know that most everything that is pure data is just going to be a regular lowercase word. And that's going to give me exactly what I want when I do that export. Tax rate. Another thing that I want to ignore is global fields. Global fields make absolutely no sense in order to export those. They are purely there for the purpose of facilitating the user interface. You are constantly using global fields as key fields or as values in order to drive what a portal will display, and it's only on a user-by-user basis. So one of the things that I did when I established the FileMaker standards was I said, you know what, mixed within here, when I'm looking at all of these types, I have all of these fields, let's say, for example, all of these text fields, and they all sort of look the same. I've got method, summary, type, product category. How can I distinguish between these in terms of which one is actually my data field, which one's being used for the user interface, and which ones are globals? So I found that for me, for anything that was global in nature, just making that field in particular, all caps, made it much easier for me to distinguish, oh, that's a global field. So that would take a long time to actually rename, but I'll just do it here on search. So anything that is a global, when you come into a database that I have designed, and I might use, underscores is one that's, I don't know, it's a little bit of a, sometimes I use the underscores, sometimes I don't. You can see that in the nature of naming something as an all global, but not using the underscore, it becomes much more difficult to distinguish each of the words when you're not using spaces. Whereas date payment, if this is a camel case, date payment still is easier to read, even though I've started with lowercase. And FileMaker, we'll talk about these. Let me rename a couple of these. Status filter, and I'll give that underscore again. It is pretty nice to be able to read the multiple words when you're ever going to use all uppercase on your global fields. But hopefully you can see right here, I'm going to have to do this category. Sorry, I just have to do it. It just drives me crazy when I see things that are not according to how I sort of visualize a FileMaker database. And by the way, the keys that I'm using here in order to jump, you can see the cursor right here. Right there, the cursor. Notice that it's jumping from word to word. The Option key and the arrow will jump from the next logical word. And I think it does this if it's on Windows, it's either Alt or Control. If you basically play with those keys, it's much easier for renaming rather than selecting with your mouse. So I can jump right to this spacing and then put in that and click Change and be done really quickly. So another thing that deals with my naming conventions, or the ones that I prefer to use, is that on every table, you will have, in most all cases, one primary key value. And so for me, what I decided to do was, rather than, you can see that FileMaker actually uses, FileMaker didn't even use a standard here in their invoices database, because we can see that these three fields actually represent their primary key and their foreign keys. So there's no naming standard here in this file because the primary key itself looks like the rest of all of the other fields. And the foreign keys themselves are global, which to me immediately said global fields, but they're not global fields. They're foreign keys in this particular case. So the way that I approached this was, I thought to myself, if every single table well, not every single will, but let's say 95% of your tables, even when you don't even think a table needs to have a primary key, and we'll go through primary keys when we start to take a look at the structure part of this series. Even when you don't think you need a primary key, ultimately you end up adding primary keys to tables where you didn't think you needed a primary key. So there's really very little consequence to actually adding a primary key to all of your tables. And for me, a primary key basically became ID. And that was it. Across the board, every table, if I was looking at my people table, people ID. If I was looking at my invoices, invoices ID. If I was looking at my individual line items for invoices, a line item ID. It instantly is recognizable across all tables if you just name it the exact same thing. So every table being named just simply ID for your primary key really comes into play when you start to see how the rest of your fields are actually referenced in all of the rest of your FileMaker programming. And let's take a look at why. I'll zoom in here and we'll just use the notes field for the purpose of this demonstration because we don't need to go into the rest of the areas of FileMaker. The way that FileMaker fields are displayed in most of your FileMaker programming come in the form of table name, double colons, and then field name. Or in my case, it would be like that, field name. So if we think about this, if the table name actually gives me, as a readable word, the actual context in which I'm dealing with this table occurrence versus that table occurrence, that's coming first, and that's the most descriptive. So does it really make sense that I need to name the actual field name something representative of the table if the table name is already going to be there in most instances? Because what ended up happening was, let's say, for example, we had a table occurrence that references the people table, but it's taking on the role of customer information or something related to customer. If I put in customer ID field, yeah, that's pretty easy to understand, but from the standpoint of all of the different things that you build into your FileMaker database, what's more simple than customer ID? Or if you've got a table occurrence and it's vendor's ID, it's simple, it's straightforward, and you know instantly that it's the primary key. So where do we expand from that for our foreign keys? Well, anytime that I wanted to distinguish a primary key from a foreign key, I decided, where is the foreign key actually coming from? And that answered the question for me. The foreign key is always coming from another table. Why don't I just put the name of that table as part of the foreign key? So in that case, vendor underscore with the actual table name, in this case I renamed it to line items, became very clear to me that, okay, this is coming from this particular table. This example doesn't necessarily make sense, but I knew that it was dealing with a key relationship, but it was foreign in nature because it has the table name appended to it. Otherwise, if there is no table name, then it simply is the primary key because all primary keys are just named ID. And that made a very simple, straightforward structure for me. So again, if you're a new FileMaker learner, hopefully these conventions are going to help you out because if you use them across all of your tables, things become much easier to understand in your own solution because you've enforced your own standards. So let me just rename these so that we can take a look at what they would look like in reality. So this is actually coming from, we are in the invoices table right now. So this is a match field or a foreign key coming from the customer table, or what FileMaker had named the customer table. And remember, I renamed it to people. This is also coming from the products table. Now again, FileMaker does this in their own documentation. It's actually very disconcerting. FileMaker interchangeably uses the words table and table occurrence. And it's very difficult to know which is which when you're brand new learning FileMaker because sometimes they'll use table occurrence, but they mean table. And sometimes they'll say, many times they will say table and they mean table occurrence. And those are two somewhat distinctly different things. You have actual tables, then in the relationships graph, you have table occurrences. So I always like to precisely name my key fields so that they match. So product would not work because I'm using the plural instead of the singular. So this, in turn, becomes ID underscore products, plural. Very key thing to make sure that you use your matching. And what's happening as a result of this? Well, as we're going to see here, oops, a little bit of a bad zoom there, customer ID match field. So this one becomes ID people, which is already plural. And we change that. And let's go sort this the way that I'm going to sort this when I actually upload this. And hopefully this starts to become very clear in terms of why the field naming becomes so cool when you do it in this fashion. All of my key values are now grouped together. I know that I've got primary key, foreign key, foreign key. All the rest of my data is interspersed. Any of my global fields are very easy to identify. If you did want to use a prefix, you could. Now, some developers in FileMaker, you're going to see this. Some developers like to do this. They like to use a prefix, and that prefix, if it makes sense to you and you want to use it, you can. I don't prefer the prefix, but this would basically stand for global number unstored is what some developers might use. And if I wanted to actually clearly identify and group all globals together, then I could put global as a prefix just like I do with unstored. And also when it comes to summary fields, we'll add a summary field in here and then we'll do a wrap and go to our questions on this particular video. Any of these prefixes that sort all of this data together makes it so much easier to understand that that's just how I like to develop because I love to be able to understand my database. And in another video, we will get into the relationships and actual naming of table occurrences and how that can make a little bit more sense. But we're going to add that summary field that I was talking about. Whenever I add a summary field to my FileMaker database, I like to be able to know what that summary field is. So I don't use the prefix system of, summary, count of, number field, and then field name. I just don't like those prefixes. It doesn't flow like a language. It's not readable. It's cryptic. And that's just something that I'm not very fond of. So what I determined was it's much easier to just clearly say what the field is. So many times I will prefix with summary and then I will put what it actually is. Now this one I sometimes do violate my own rules here. If I'm going to use the underscore, I can do it either with or without the underscore. And again, this is just really up to you in terms of how you like to see the fields, whether you want the underscore. But whatever the summary field is that I'm creating, let's say it's a summary count of, amount. You can see what I've actually done is I'm first giving it the prefix, and then next I'm saying what is the type of summary field that the field actually is, and then what is the field that it's actually dealing with. So I don't know that there's an amount field in here, but when we create this, you're going to see all of the different summary field names that you could use. So for summary fields, I would say summary total of, summary average of, summary count of, summary minimum. I use these exact words in the name of the field because when you're looking at choosing these in FileMaker's Field Picker dialog box, when you're creating scripts, when you're adding things to layouts, being able to see them, and especially when the database is sorted on that field name, and just scroll right to the section of all of your summary fields and choose exactly what summary, maximum of the discount. Boom. Easy. Easy peasy. Nothing to have to worry about. It's a standard, you've followed through with it, and it makes it really easy to add to your database. So here in this case, I don't know that I have an amount in here, and we'll just go ahead and pretend with that. I don't know, I could go right here, subtotal. Let's say total of subtotal, and we'll create that one. And so I would come in here and change this to total of, and rename it to subtotal. And again, if underscores help you, there's nothing wrong in terms of my personal preference of doing that right there and getting that summary of subtotal. So now you have very clearly named names. It's much easier. They group for you as a developer, and for the most part, you're going to have a much more enjoyable experience with your FileMaker database, especially when it starts to get 5 times more complex than what we see right here. When you've got table occurrences going all over the place and a massive spider web of interconnections, making sense of your database is going to be the #1 most important thing to you. And in later videos, we'll get into organizing this graph, using colors, and doing all of those other things. This is the mastery course of FileMaker. But that's what I have for you today about naming fields. I really want to keep these to 30 minutes on average. I've even read that 18 minutes is probably the ideal video length on YouTube in terms of attention span. But let's take a look at our questions, see if we've got any with regards to naming and conventions for those of you that are live. Switch to my video chat here and open up the chat. All right. Well, this is a self-explanatory video. Looks like we don't have any questions. Hey, Eric, Ahmed, and HBH Group, some of my regulars on my videos here. Not memorialized, that would be terrible. Captured for the length of all time on these videos. Those of you that are checking in on the videos and giving the live feedback. So I think that's going to give this video a wrap. I hope that the content that I've provided here has helped you out with naming your own, using what I have, and you don't have to use exactly what I've got, but hopefully by discussing it in this video, you've been able to get some better ideas and take either what you already have and sort of adapt that. FileMaker is very flexible about renaming as well, by the way, and basically coming up with a system that will help you make better sense of your database as you move forward. And we'll probably be using this database and be making some changes here in it. It's a great example of how to move this database forward in terms of making it a little bit more modern. We'll switch it to using some actual UUIDs for keys, but we'll also be keeping some of the functionality that we want, such as being able to look up invoices based on an invoice number and so forth like that. Lee asks, are there any tricks for doing mass changes? Unfortunately, there are not that I am aware of. The only tricks that you would be able to use if you are an advanced FileMaker developer and you are interested in it would be that FileMaker does have a SQL API. And that SQL API, in order to make changes to the structure of the database, only come through the use of a plugin. So FileMaker has its own function called execute SQL, but if you are adventurous enough, it is possible to do bulk changes via one single SQL statement, but you would need to actually use a plugin to do so, which has full access to being able to rename fields and doing it in bulk. All right, let's see. Linking of foreign key is best on the ID or other field is best. In most cases, you will be linking two different tables, and we'll be getting into this into the structure area of this whole series based on your primary keys to your foreign keys. That's typically what you're linking on. You can link, for the purpose of the interface, you will link to other fields in order to filter data out, and we'll learn about filtering. There's many different ways to filter out data. You're always wanting to see subsets of things. What are all of the records that were in 2017? What were all the records within 2017 that also were above or below $500 or $1,000? That's all data filtering, and we'll definitely be getting into that in other videos. All right, so I think that's going to bring us to a wrap for this particular episode. Again, I hope this information has helped you out. You're going to be able to subscribe to these videos or subscribe to my channel to be notified of these videos. You can always head over to FileMakerMagazine.com, sign up there, and the next video will be coming up right here in this series. So as always, leave your comments and down below, and give me a thumbs up if these videos are helping you out. All right, see you later.